job bringing out chairs. Good job bringing out chairs. You get a pat on the back.
I don't have any. Which is probably a bad idea.
I saw them. Let me make sure I didn't take them, but I don't think I did. I saw them. They were on this table.
I know. I grabbed them, but now I can't find them.
I think it is. I think it's working, but I'm not sure if it's on.
Hello, hello. Let's get started. So you're not running too far behind. Let's answer the phone or turn the phones off, please. I'm going to make an introduction to of my dear partner Lisa, who will then introduce our very esteemed special guest. But first I wanted to say just how emotional it is and how lucky and how beautiful it is to have you all back here and just to be able to invite you to this wonderful building. And it's been so long. I feel very emotional about it. We came up with this subject, the shape of empathy, several years ago now, or at least a couple years ago, and we actually had this is the third iteration of the group of guest lecturers, and Lisa, I know her notes and didn't actually mention this. Our guest tonight is the only one who lasted all the way through all three iterations. One thing I wanted to say about the subject is that we didn't ask our speakers to address the subject directly. We simply chose speakers who we thought whose work would address it anyway. So, and I didn't want them to have to make a special lecture. Instead, just naturally address the subject. And yeah, I'm just going to hand it over to Lisa, who will make the real introduction.
So, hello everyone. I'm equally feeling just so pleased and touched to see everyone tonight. And I don't know how much more real this introduction will be than Byron's introduction, but Steffani Jemison is a visual artist, a scholar, an educator, a gymnast, a writer, and my friend. It's especially pleasurable to have her here tonight, a delayed gratification, as Byron mentioned, after our 2 canceled summers. I think she is equally relieved to fulfill this commitment, so I'll stop bugging her. It's fitting that she's the first speaker of our session to address the shape of empathy. Her art practice is deeply empathetic and smart. I've worked alongside Steffani in so many different capacities, first in our side-by-side exhibitions at Lax Art in 2013, which is in LA, then at the Drawing Center, along with artists Heather Hart and Gina Valentine, curating a culminating exhibition for the Drawing Center's historical viewing program. The group of artists, Heather, Steffani, and Gina, came up with a brilliant and complex way to manifest an exhibition which encompassed an archive of artists drawing over the span of 40 years, using a unique classification system based on Colson Whitehead's novel, The Intuitionist. It's wonderful to see her vision grow as an artist to include film, performance, and mime. I'm a huge fan and could go on for too long and about her many talents, but would prefer to let her speak about her practice. She has presented solo exhibitions and commissioned performances at the Museum of Modern Art, the Stedelijk Museum, Mass MoCA, the Jeu des Palmes, the RISD Museum, and other institutions domestically and internationally. Her work is in the public collections of the Brooklyn Museum, the Whitney Museum, the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Museum of Modern Art, and many others. She has received numerous prestigious awards and grants, including the Guggenheim, Creative Capital, Art Matters, and was a fellow at the Radcliffe Institute, Harvard University. Jemison's first novel, I just learned, will be published by Primary Information in 2022, and she received her BA in Comparative Literature from Columbia University and an MFA from the Institute of Chicago. She is presently an assistant professor at the Mason Gross School of the Arts at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. So, please help me welcome Steffani.
We're actually, could we leave the lights on for just 1 minute, like the first 5 or 10 minutes? Is that okay?
Sure, totally.
Great. And is it better for me to speak into the microphone? There's a lot of people here. Okay. I want to thank Lisa and Byron so much for the invitation. It's incredible to finally be here, not because I've been bugged by Lisa, but because I've truly been looking forward to it. The kind of convening theme, the shape of empathy, is so beautiful, and speaks to the convergence of, on the one hand, a set of formal considerations that I know are really urgent to the two of you and to all of us, and also to a set of real social problems and challenges that all of us are thinking through. So I'm really excited. I understand, Byron, I didn't get the memo that I wasn't supposed to prepare a specific talk. So I sort of shaped some things that I might have maybe would have otherwise discussed, but
I tricked you.
I was tricked. It's okay, but in ways that I hope will resonate with the theme, but also will give you a sense of sort of how I think, maybe walk you through how I think as an artist. And I want to start actually by doing a little activity, which is why I wanted to keep the lights on. So there's a classic acting exercise that I'm sure many of you know called the mirror, in which two partners face each other, so you're going to have to partner up. I noticed that when I walked in, I was like, okay, we've got this. We have an even number of people in each row. This is like a totally ordered group of chairs. No longer. But I know that you'll each be able to find a partner. It can be someone that you know, or it can be someone who's new to you, a neighbor. And I'm going to ask, so in the classic and the traditional version of this exercise, often one person is sort of designated as a leader and another person is kind of a follower. What we're going to try and do is something a little bit different. I'm going to invite you to try to create a situation with your partner in which you can't tell who's leading and who's following, in which it feels as though your movements are emerging from somewhere in between the two of you. So I'm going to invite you to try to find that space, and I'll give you a few moments to find it, and we'll use that to kind of come together in the room, and as a kind of opening exercise that will introduce us to everything else that I'm going to talk about later. So you don't have to get up. You can if you want, but you can use your face, you can use your hands, you can use your arms, you can use your legs. started. So I understand that it was hard to hear me before. We just turned up the volume and turned the speakers so that they're facing out a little bit more, and hopefully that will help. There was also a request for me to stand up. I would actually prefer to sit because I have 2 hands but 3 things to do. Hold the microphone, hold the iPad, which has my notes, and change the slides.
You should sit.
Okay. But if it turns out that you're still having trouble, then let me know and we can see what we can figure out. I think there's also a little bit of room to turn up the volume more in on the speakers.
I wonder whether the volume of your... Oh no, that has nothing to do with it.
No, the microphone isn't going into.
I think we'll just go with that.
You don't want to have it too close to the
Oh,
Zoom. That's the only thing.
really?
A little bit. Maybe like,
Because there's sound coming out of there?
yeah, because the Zoom people are listening in.
Oh, and it's going to give them feedback?
A little bit. A little bit. I think it's fine.
Okay, let's try it.
Okay, so thanks everyone for indulging me with our mirroring exercise. I wanted to start with that in part because one of the ideas, one of the things I was thinking about a lot as I prepared for this conversation is the concept, the framework of mirror neurons. So most of you have heard of those, right? The little brain cells that fire when we move. And when we observe the same movement from another. Biologists and psychologists tell us that our bodies are in constant dialogue and that it's primarily through the activity of mirroring, consciously or unconsciously, the actions and movements of others that we come to understand them. And in fact, that this ability to mirror seems to be a prerequisite of healthy interpersonal relations, which we know because I read this in an article in the New York Times a few years ago. We know this because of a study about the pernicious effects of Botox injections, which apparently affect both empathy and memory. So scientists found that without the ability to physically mimic the expressions we encounter, our capacity to identify is degraded. We can turn out the lights also, and I'll start to share the video. The 20th century instructor of acting and physical theater, Jacques Lecoq. His well-known students include the comedian Sacha Baron Cohen, the actor Geoffrey Rush, and the Lion King theater director Julie Taymor. So Jacques Lecoq spoke often about imitation and yawning, both of which are infections, contagious, catching. When 2 individuals are having a pleasant conversation, he says, they share behavior. Side by side, they walk in step. When they begin to disagree, each one starts to walk at his own pace. If I cross my arms or my legs, my interlocutor, without realizing it, will copy my gesture as he becomes more attentive, and all the more so if he finds me hard to understand. So just now I called this mirroring exercise, I said it was a classic acting exercise, but for many of you, it may actually conjure memories of a game which may have been fun or maybe horrifying that you played with a sibling maybe as a kid. And what was horrifying for me, I'll say I have a brother who's 2 years younger, so pretty much all games ended up in disaster. But what was horrifying about it with me, for me, is that often what happened is that I felt that my agency was compromised. So I was confronted not with a copy of my authentic self, but with a kind of monstrous reflection of myself. And the worst part was always that it's a game without end, that there's this other being tethered to me that is permanently entertained by my inability to evade them. You guys remember what this felt like, right? So many of us understand this kind of mimicry as just copying, a parlor trick. And yet, one of the things that I've been wondering and thinking a lot about is what it means to use the body not to engage in an endless reflection of surfaces and effects, but to understand something deeper. In his Poetics, the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle wrote that, quote, "Man is, of all animals, the one most drawn to mime, and it is through miming that he acquires all of his knowledge." And I'm going to repeat that. It is through miming that he acquires all of his knowledge. So I'm going to talk more about pantomime later. It's a subject of some of my recent work, as Lisa mentioned, and also an activity I've been thinking a lot about. But first, I want to focus on the other part of what he said about knowledge and how it's acquired. One of the questions I've explored most urgently in my recent work is, what do we really know of one another? And how is knowledge different from knowing, like the activity of knowing? What does knowing feel like? How do we know what we know? Is knowing or is understanding, is it a feeling? Is it a sensation in the body? Do you feel it in your head? Do you feel it in your stomach? Do you feel it in your, and if I had an extra finger here, I would put it up to make scare quotes. Do you feel it in your heart? Is knowing an activity? Is it something that you do before you think? How much or how little does understanding have to do with cognition, with thinking? Like, is knowing and thinking, can they be separated, or are they the same thing? And then what can we learn through contact with other people or other beings? And maybe the other sort of part of that question would be, do we ever really know anything like on our own? Is there any other way of knowing? So do phrases like self-taught mean anything at all? In the end, can we ever alone be responsible for anything that we know? And then there's another set of questions that just have to do with what it means to operate intentionally in a space of not knowing, as we're sometimes called to do, sometimes asked to do, maybe sometimes ethically required to do. And related to that is the question, maybe, can we unlearn what we know? So this is the first of a few clusters of questions that I'm going to share with you today. And as I was writing this and preparing those questions, I had a flashback to this awful talk that I had to give a few years ago to a bunch of traditional scholars and like scientists, mathematicians, etc. And afterward, one of them came up to me really smugly and said, "You know, it must be really nice to be able to ask so many questions without ever having to have answers." I was mortified, but also really upset. For me, generating questions, evoking that which is momentarily or sometimes even permanently beyond the horizon of my understanding, it's like the essence of what it means to be an artist. It's also what it means for me to be a living, thinking, and especially a political being, is to renew, sustain that capacity to imagine or to evoke that which is beyond my own understanding. So I hope that today's conversation and the material that I share with you today will invite you to do a little bit of that for yourself. And with that in mind, I'm going to offer my full, wholehearted, generous, biggest possible permission for you to allow your mind to wander as I'm speaking. And I'm going to sort of walk you through a few representative threads in my practice, but I'm not so much going to describe what I'm doing. I'm not describing the work or how I made it exactly, but I'm sort of talking you through what I was thinking when what I was thinking when I made something, or sort of the set of questions or the set of ideas that I was working through, and maybe the set of thorny problems that helped me to generate the work. So if you have questions about how something was made or some aspect of the kind of concrete nitty-gritty details of the practice, feel free to ask those at the end. I'm really happy to answer those. But while I'm talking, I would really encourage you to allow your mind to wander, allow this maybe an image or a phrase or a word to spark some exciting next steps for you. With that, I will also give a little bit of a caveat that I'm sharing a lot of material today. I have lots of quotations, and I have lots of resources, and there's lots of names. So you can feel free to come up afterward if you have a question, maybe there was something you didn't quite catch. And also, again, permission to not really capture everything that I say, and instead allow it to float by, and if there's something that sticks, then that's wonderful. So Lisa mentioned that I majored in comparative literature in college. I went to Columbia, and my first loves were actually literature and philosophy, and maybe also music. So I never took an art class as an undergraduate, and instead I spent a lot of my time in college thinking about stories and the ways that we tell them. Of course, I was always thinking about the stories of my own family, so stories of mobility, migration, dispersion. At the same time, I was interested in the conventions, which we sometimes called, in school, we sometimes called psychological realism. They came to define the traditional novel, and that also came to define classical Hollywood cinema. So conventions that rely on psychological explanations for cause and effect, how one thing follows another. Stories that turn on individual growth and epiphany. Protagonists whose heroic journeys give form and offer resolution. Those were the kinds of stories that I mostly studied in school. And I was really interested in the political implications of those story structures, especially the emphasis on an individual hero's control over their own fate. After a few years, this is also for the undergraduate students here, when I finished school, I spent a few years in New York working at a residency program, which was really, really wonderful and gave me the opportunity to meet and connect with and learn from many, many, many hundreds of artists. And it was there that I was inspired to actually study art, that I realized that maybe something about this engagement with ideas could actually be explored through practice as an artist, which I had never known an artist before. I didn't know that it was possible. So after a few years of working with artists at this residency program, I decided to study film, which I thought would synthesize my interests in narrative and language, and also performance and music and photography. And it wasn't long before I switched and began to study fine art. With a focus, particularly initially, with a focus on video. In graduate school, I watched and was inspired by generations of video artists, but I was also reading and thinking a lot about hip-hop fiction. Street fiction was what we called it then, which was defined by a set of rules so idiosyncratic that to call them novels would really do a disservice to what were often melodramatic and very episodic storylines, which would conveniently use devices like twins to emphasize fate rather than heroic control. I also turned to moments in the history of cinema and video in which narrative structure deviated from this model that I described earlier, classical Hollywood cinema. I was especially curious about the narrative strategies of the very earliest fiction films made between, say, 1896 and 1907, which often featured repetitive, recursive narratives that reduced the value of the individual protagonist, ignored psychology, allowed one thing to follow another without tension, and ignored or minimized the possibility of change. Several of the videos I began to create during that time, including Maniac Chase and Escaped Lunatic, were inspired by some of these films from the early 1900s. So for example, in the original Escaped Lunatic and Maniac Chase, there were two versions of the same film, and you saw a little bit of one just now. An inmate escapes from an insane asylum, jogs through the grounds, followed by several orderlies, and eventually runs back into his cell. And the film was sometimes actually shown again and again on a loop. As I developed work in Chicago, Houston, and New York, I researched actual stories of turn-of-the-century escapees. This figure of the quote-unquote escaped lunatic was really a Victorian obsession. In fact, anxiety surrounding these distinct concepts, escape and lunatic, rested precisely on the instability of turn-of-the-century categories of subjectivity and self-possession. Although our culture privileges travel and mobility, consider, for example, the romantic discovery narrative that correlates physical movement outward into the territory of the unknown with movement inward toward deep subjectivity, I'm often reminded that not all physical travel is consensual, and not all mobility produces enlightenment. Consider, for example, forced migration, enslavement, homelessness, rites of passage, imprisonment, escape. A related work, Personal, was envisioned as a dialogue with another early Chase film, How a New York City Nobleman Got a Wife in the New York Herald Tribune. During several months of working with almost 12 actors, sorry, I'm not sure, I hear that the sound is coming in and out, and oops, let me turn this off. And I'm not sure why it is, but let me know if you're having trouble hearing me. So, during several months of working with almost 12 actors, this piece, Personal, evolved into something else beyond the sort of inspiration work. An arena where motion is ambiguous, every step is met with an equal and opposite reaction. Like the works Escaped Lunatic and Maniac Chase, it moves and stays still at the same time. Stasis is one of its most important subjects. For me, and you'll see this throughout my work, I'll refer to these ideas again and again. Formal concepts like symmetry have implications that are ethical and aesthetic at the same time. In 2019, I made a video called In Succession, one in a constellation of videos, sculpture, and movement works that are loosely inspired by specific historical events in New York and New Jersey, in which the acrobat is reported as a figure of transgression. Among other things, this body of work was sparked by an article I found from 1931 that described how a group of black men in a vehicle encountered a white woman on the second floor of a burning building. According to the New York Times, and this particular story actually made national news, the men spontaneously formed a human pyramid to rescue her before disappearing into the night, refusing to give their contact information to police. A second scenario, set in the Upper East Side of Manhattan, describes the activities of an, quote, acrobatic Negro who burgled apartments on upper floors of Park Avenue apartment buildings, claiming to be stealing gems from the rich to provide food to Harlem's poor. And a third seed for this body of work from the New York Times was the description of a daring and successful escape incident at Middlesex County Jail in the year 1900. A group of 6 men, the New York Times called them tramps, formed a human pyramid, cut a hole in the ceiling, and escaped. So those stories and others led me to the next cluster of questions that I'm going to share now. How can we let our bodies become means or supports, the ways that bricks and beams are means? In other words, when can bodies become architecture? In other words, how do we stand on and be stood upon at the same time? How do we decide when to risk it all together? How are the concepts of risk and possibility inextricably linked? How do we learn on the fly? How do we fly? If we're all we've got, how do we use ourselves to find the forms of the future? Can everyday movements, the kinds of movements that are passed directly from one body to the next, help us learn how to be of service to one another in the future? And what forms could service take? How do we find freedom with rather than freedom from each other? So as you can tell from the works that I've shared so far, movement is always on my mind. I was born in Berkeley. I grew up in Ohio. I live in Brooklyn now. I've lived in Brooklyn for a decade, in New York for a little over 20 years. I traveled 100 miles this afternoon to speak to you here in Connecticut. Every week during the academic year, I travel to New Jersey. I don't know if it counts as travel. I drive to New Jersey or take the train to New Jersey to teach at Rutgers in New Brunswick. 40 years ago, my mother also went to New Brunswick, New Jersey, from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where her family was from, where she was raised. She studied teaching at Rutgers herself. And 40 years before that, her family traveled from North Carolina to Pittsburgh. My mother is pretty sure that it was to escape something, but from what, she doesn't quite know. Of course, they're also always in search of something. Some things don't change. In 2018, Black Americans were more likely to die than white Americans at almost any age, for almost any reason. Black Americans have the highest death rate and shortest survival of any racial and ethnic group in the US for most cancers. The HIV death rate among Black Americans of all ages was 641.5% greater than the death rate among white Americans in 2015. Black American mothers die in childbirth at 3 times the rate of white mothers. Black Americans between the ages of 18 and 64 are between 40 and 45% more likely to die than their white counterparts at any given time. Black Americans are more likely to die than white Americans at almost any age, for almost any reason. You may have heard of scholar and Black Panther Party activist Huey P. Newton. Newton argues that the short lives and premature deaths of the oppressed are a form of murder at the hands of the state. His argument was that submitting to oppression is not living, but in fact allowing yourself to be killed, slowly or quickly, of a heart attack or an infection or poverty or poor health or accident or homicide, dramatically or in a manner that is barely registered at all. All of these are allowing yourselves to die at the hands of the oppressor. He suggests that Black folks should instead dedicate their lives and their deaths to that cause that might, quote, lead to change in those social and political conditions that are literally killing us. Newton wrote, "There is an old African saying, 'I am we.' If you met an African in ancient times and asked him who he was, he would reply, 'I am we,'" end quote. Newton wrote, quote, "This is revolutionary. This is the logic of revolutionary suicide. I, we, all of us are the one and the multitude." Newton wrote, quote, "By hoping and desiring, the revolutionary suicide chooses life. He is, in the words of Nietzsche, an arrow of longing for another shore." Newton wrote, quote, "The revolutionary suicide is a fool for the revolution in the way that Paul meant when he spoke of being a fool for Christ. That foolishness can move the mountain of oppression. It is our great leap in our commitment to the dead and the unborn." So if I, Steffani, imagine myself as an arrow of longing for another shore, an arrow among other arrows, in flight with other flyers, in orientation rather than aiming at a target, then the word utopia starts to be helpful. Not as a way to describe a destination, but rather as a capacity, a particular kind of agility or mobility in human thinking. So for me, utopia is a tool that situates the present with relation to its alternatives. Not an activity, but a capacity for activity. A band that connects us to the dead and to the sacrificed. Utopia is a promise that incentivizes the activity of the present by reminding it of a range of possible futures. The arrow as a metaphor has been used by philosophers Zeno and Bergson and Masumi and so many others to refer to the ways in which we are always in passing. There's something about arrows that feels like the relationship between desire and work and intention and escape. Maybe it's because we know how it feels to try to hit a mark when all we can really guarantee is that we're moving in a direction. Maybe it's the moment of possibility after the arrow leaves the bow. Maybe it has something to do with suspension. I come from a family of educators. My father's father was a preacher. My Aunt Anne was a school principal. My Aunt Gina is a high school librarian. Both of my parents taught briefly in public schools. I mentioned before that my mother went to Rutgers to study teaching. It didn't last long, but she did teach briefly. And maybe that might be one reason why I think so much about learning and teaching. And sometimes in my work, I've explicitly sought to create spaces where others can learn or think about learning. For example, in 2009, the artist Jamal Cyrus and I opened up a space for study, which we called Book Club in Houston. A few years later, we were invited by the New Museum to bring an iteration of our ideas to the museum. And we decided to use a quotation in artwork by theorist, sculptor, painter, tagger, and MC Ramosi as a starting point. Ramosi used the phrase, "Alpha's bet is not over yet," as a rallying cry. His body of work emphasized that the alphabet is merely a gentleman's agreement, a social contract. My exploration of Black literacies through Alpha's bet and since has focused on private and coded approaches to writing, interpretation, and divination that are often sustained with the very goal of excluding the uninitiated, acknowledging marginality and using it as a form of strength. These include Hamptonese, the private language created by James Hampton, whose profession was janitor, but whose life's work was to create a series of comprehensive, visionary, creative systems. They also include the supreme alphabet and supreme mathematics, both systems of interpretation associated with the nation of gods and earth, a spin-off of the Nation of Islam with a similarly eschatological focus. They also include Rammell's own Gothic futurism, a theoretical approach that's deeply influenced by the supreme alphabet and borrows many of its meanings. Private codes like this have a long history in practice and in myth. In Black culture, coded words, phrases, and visual communication systems, including quilts, which may have served as a kind of pictorial writing, are all important predecessors to the way that I have been thinking about writing as a weapon to be deployed strategically, politically, and often privately. Conversely, I also think about quiet as action, affirmation, and resistance, and in that I've continued to mine early cinema as a source of ideas. This research recently led me to pantomime, the interface between language and movement, which profoundly influenced conventions around the performance of self and the limits of speech at the turn of the 20th century. I used to always say turn of the century, and then my students remind me that I was born in the 1900s, and there have been 2 turns of the century. So now I have to be more clear. I'm gonna skip this one. So a recent work, Sensus Plenior, takes as its subject the specific contemporary practice of pantomime in the Black church, with a focus on the approach of Reverend Susan Webb, leader of the Master Mime Ministry of Harlem. Rather than clarifying language through language, Webb's gestures situate interpretation within the affective register of the body, in a place where language cannot reach. Webb rejects performance as a descriptor for her work, instead preferring the word ministry. Relay, echo, identification, and mirroring are central to the concepts of pantomime and mimicry. Ministers model the activity of opening the body to the spirit in order to make oneself absolutely receptive, allowing the body to be a vessel or medium that pours to another vessel that pours to another vessel. How do we move? How are we moved by each other? How do we have the courage to pour ourselves into another without fear of depletion? Can this help us find an alternative to goal-oriented, hierarchical vocabularies of learning and teaching? These days I think a lot about writing, knowing how to write, reading, knowing how to read, and power. About how written language is the medium of our education system and how its mastery is central to that system. And I say I'm thinking throughout this conversation today, I keep saying, I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about that, but actually, of course, I'm reading. And so thinking, I'm also thinking about how difficult it is to separate reading, writing, and thinking. And I'm thinking about the education system that has caused that to be the case, that writing, thinking, and reading are so continuous for me. As I've worked in dialogue with Susan Webb and other artists, I've been thinking in particular about the proximity of writing and drawing, considering drawing very much within an expanded field that includes gesture. I can make a mark and not know whether I am drawing or writing. I've been thinking a lot about marks and how they accumulate, what it means to accumulate marks and to believe that this accumulation is simultaneously a drawing, a text, and an archive. So I'm thinking, as I'm so often thinking about the proximity of writing to drawing, about archives and how they're always already oriented toward the future. What is the archive but that which awaits activation? I wonder often about the ways in which drawings are active, are records of activity, are anticipatory. I wonder about the difference between acting, recording action, and awaiting activation. I think about the stroke, the glyph, and the mark as constituent components, in other words, of drawing and language. About the notebooks of James Hampton, the time cryptographers have spent trying to translate those marks into letters or words. If they cannot be understood, are they still writing? About Ricky McCormick, whose mother told the FBI he couldn't spell anything, just scribble. I think about whether the concept of translation has any meaningful relationship to the activity of drawing or the drawing object. I think about what happens when writing is decoupled from communication or when it is deliberately encoded. About automatic drawing and speaking in tongues and spirit writing and technologies of representation and transcription as symbolic systems from which we are periodically compelled to escape. I consider the fact that drawing and writing are gerunds, behaving like nouns but always derived from and recalling the verb. I think about action and resistance. I think about understanding and resistance. And I'm going to share just a few quick stories about writing and drawing, copying or imitating, learning, understanding, knowing, and resisting, all together. William Wells Brown, formerly a slave, learned to write on boards in the form of a fence. He said, quote, "I carried a piece of chalk in my pocket, and whenever I met a boy, I would stop him and take out my chalk and get a board fence and then commence. First, I made some flourishes with no meaning and called a boy up and said, 'Do you see that? Can you beat that writing?' Said he, 'That's not writing.' I said, 'Is that not William Wells Brown?' 'Give me the chalk,' says he, and wrote out in large letters, 'Williams Wells Brown.' And I marked up the fence for nearly a quarter of a mile trying to copy, till I got so I could write my name. Then I went on with my chalking, and in fact, all board fences within half a mile of where I lived were marked over with some kind of figures I had made in trying to learn how to write. Henry Bibb, born enslaved in Kentucky and later founder of The Voice of the Fugitive, an abolitionist newspaper published in Canada, wrote, "Whenever I got hold of an old letter that had been thrown away, or a piece of white paper, I would save it to write on. I've often gone off in the woods and spent the greater part of the day alone, trying to learn how to write myself a pass by writing on the backs of old letters. By doing so, I got the use of a pen and could form letters as well as I can now, but knew not what they were." In the Confessions of Nat Turner, transcribed by Thomas Gray, Nat claims that he always knew how to write without ever being taught. I quote, "My grandmother, who was very religious and to whom I was much attached, my master who belonged to the church, and other religious persons who visited the house and whom I often saw at prayers, noticing the singularity of my manners, I suppose, and my uncommon intelligence for a child, remarked that I had too much sense to be raised, and if I was, I would never be of service to anyone as a slave. The manner in which I learned to read and write not only had great influence on my own mind, as I acquired it with the most perfect ease, so much so that I have no recollection whatever of learning the alphabet, but to the astonishment of the family, One day, when a book was shown to me to keep me from crying, I began spelling the names of different objects. This was a source of wonder to all in the neighborhood, particularly the blacks, and this learning was constantly improved at all opportunities. When I got large enough to go to work while employed, I was reflecting on many things that would present themselves to my imagination. And whenever an opportunity occurred of looking at a book, when the school children were getting their lessons, I would find many things that the fertility of my own imagination had depicted to me before. All my time not devoted to my master's service was spent either in prayer or in making experiments in casting different things in molds made of earth, in attempting to make paper, gunpowder, and many other experiments that, although I could not perfect, yet convinced me of its practicability if I had the means. And later in 1831, the text continues, while laboring in the field, I discovered drops of blood on the corn as though it were dew from heaven. And I communicated it to many, both white and black, in the neighborhood, and I then found on the leaves in the woods hieroglyphic characters and numbers with the forms of men in different attitudes, portrayed in blood, and representing the figures I had seen before in the heavens. And as the leaves on the trees bore impression of the figures I had seen in the heavens, it was plain to me that the Savior was about to lay down the yoke he had borne for the sins of men, and the great day of judgment was at hand. Now I'm thinking about hieroglyphics, about how this word hieroglyphics found its way into this heavily mediated text from 1832. What that word, implying both the authority of the written word and the secrecy of code, implying the history of authority of Africa, might have meant to Nat Turner, a man raised by a mother, Nancy, and paternal grandmother, Bridget, who were both born in West Africa and may well have been literate in Arabic or in Sabidi or Ajami. I'm thinking about the way that this revelation in a field pivots between writing and drawing, between reading and looking, between private and public, simultaneously of labor and of leisure, simultaneously of the present and the past. In a workshop a few years ago, just before the pandemic, I was asked by my friend, the choreographer Andre Zachary, to assume the position of a graffiti writer who is hiding in plain sight. How would you move, he asked us. And maybe the answer was, how we always move. The scholar and poet Fred Moten has, I know it's 8 o'clock, it's 8:05, but we're almost done. The scholar and poet Fred Moten has described blackness as, quote, an aim that is always out of reach. He writes, it hurts so much that we have to celebrate. That we have to celebrate is what hurts so much. What do you do with a hurt that doesn't scab, doesn't scar, doesn't smooth? I am so used to certain kinds of pain that they have become certain kinds of comfort. I am contradiction. Playwright George C. Wolfe said, there's madness in me, and that madness sets me free. He said, my power is in my colored contradictions. Contradiction, I speak against. I am against speech. And against speech, it's a good time to toggle back to pantomime, as I promised. I know you've been waiting eagerly for me to return to pantomime. So pantomime is most often translated as imitator of all, imitator of everything. The etymology is Latin, pan, which means all, and mimus, or actor, imitator. But the concept of pantomime also has an alternative genealogy, one that links pantomime to Pan, the god of Arcadia, or nature. So in this other etymology, pantomime actually means imitator of nature. And there is a difference. To explore this, I'm going to turn to British theater historian, just for now, I'm going to turn to British theater historian R.J. Broadbent. He was active at the turn of the 20th century. In his 1901 book, History of Pantomime, Broadbent begins by making this same observation. He begins by saying, okay, mimicry is found everywhere among all animals. And he takes it one step further, proposing that camouflage can also be understood as a form of mimicry. And that theatrical strategies of imitation actually trace their genealogy to these natural practices of camouflage. He wrote, quote, "What better evidence or instances of mime can we have than in those studies of nature's handiwork, as the larger species of caterpillars when, by stretching themselves out in imitation of, and to make their foes think that they are snakes, tigers and lions choosing a background in keeping with and an imitation of the colors of their bodies in order to seize their unwary prey, and for the same purpose crocodiles imitating a rotting log, the green tint of the lizard's skin for the sake of concealment, the playful imitativeness of the mockingbird, the hysterical laugh of the hyena, the gaudy colors of tropical snakes imitated by others." I'm going to turn it down. Besides many other examples of mimicry in butterflies and hornets, wasps, ants, and bees. Broadbent called this the pantomime of nature and argued that it is the same instinctive pantomime or mimicry which each and every one of us possesses. So, back to the two etymologies for pantomime. One, imitator of all, the other one, imitator of nature. If pantomime means imitator of all, then a pantomime is like a mirror, capable of copying anything, participant in a kind of free play of signification. On the other hand, if pantomime is an imitator of nature, then the mime's ultimate referent is not another referent, but rather the real itself. And these lead to two very different paths for thinking about contemporary performance. Pantomime that plays with the nature and form of illusion, in which the mime is truly imitator of all, is still very prevalent. Consider, for example, the living statues that you see in Times Square. The thinkers I've been most in dialogue with, like Jacques Lecoq, who I referenced earlier, or Etienne de Creux, they were more committed to that other genealogy, imitator of Pan, imitator of nature itself, mime as truth. For them, imitation is an interpretive practice, an analytical tool that's immanent to the body. Said Jacques Lecoq, miming is not imitation, but a way of grasping the real that is played out in our body. He said, I love this quote, "A normal human being is played by the reality that reverberates in him." He said, "We are the receptacles of interactions that play themselves out spontaneously within us." Human beings think with their whole bodies. They are made up of complexes and gestures, and reality is in them, without them, despite them. He said, human beings must be grasped from the soles of their feet to the tops of their heads. So this is a way of analyzing movement, agency, activity through movement itself, an approach to performance that's not constructed by playwrights or transmitted orally. Rather, techniques are passed from body to 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 the present. The mime Etienne de Creux once wrote, "Penser, pousser, pousse, et pincer," which in French are almost homonyms, are also almost synonyms. Thought, pushed, thumb, pinched. He said, "Our thought pushes our gestures in the same way that the thumb of the sculptor pushes forms. And our body, sculpted from the inside, stretches. He said, our thought between its thumb and index finger pinches us along the reverse flap of our envelope, and our body, sculpted from the inside, folds. Mime is, at the same time, both sculptor and statue, end quote. So acting and being activated, moving and being moved, for me, it's another way of talking about what it means to learn, what it means to know, what it means to be known, which sort of where we began. And there's a difference here between knowledge, which feels like an accumulation of static objects, and knowing. Knowing feels like an always temporary and necessarily asymptotic, unresolved activity, rather than a state of mastery or control. You never know what you know, except in the moment or activity of calling it to memory, which is another way of saying bringing it to the body, because the cells and atoms and energy reactions that form memory are a part of our bodies. Mimes model the activity of opening the body to the spirit, emptying oneself in order to, and I return to Etienne de Creux here, quote, fill the space with the soul of God, making the body absolutely receptive, allowing the body to be a vessel, as I said before, a medium that pours to another vessel. The body is the subject and the means of study, and the end is always necessarily out of reach. So after Sensus Plenior, I made a second work exploring similar ideas called similitude. And similitude was actually kind of a body of work that included a performance and a video and some other things. The novella that Lisa mentioned that I just finished is connected to similitude as well, actually. A similitude is a similarity, a comparison, a likeness, a shadow. In the Old Testament, the Hebrew root dama is translated as comparison, figure, parable, and proverb. It also means to consider, to think, or to mean. Moreover, it shall come to pass that I shall do unto you as I thought to do unto them. That's from the book of Numbers, chapter 33, verse 56. The word for thought is dama. Thou dost not make to thee a graven image, any similitude which is in the heavens above, and which is in the earth beneath, and which is in the waters under the earth. That's Deuteronomy. I am like a pelican in the wilderness. I am like an owl of the desert. That's Psalms 102:6. It stood still, but I could not discern the form thereof. An image was before my eyes, there was silence, and I heard a voice saying, that's from Job, chapter 4, verse 16. So a few final thoughts. On a good day, and maybe we'll do this tomorrow, those of you who are in the movement workshop with me, on a good day I can hold a handstand for about 7 seconds. Probably, maybe, I would say on a good day, 10 seconds. And so it is with a certain sense of authority that I say that stasis is not static, but involves incredible effort. And that effort is sometimes visible, as in running in place, and is other times nearly imperceptible. The thousands of coordinated systems, nervous and bony and muscular, unconscious and intentional, that are required, for example, to remain standing on one's hands stationary over time, are barely visible at all. I took a class with a student of the choreographer Steve Paxton, who once reminded me that to become still involves not stilling. There is no such thing as stilling, but rather applying an equal and opposite reaction. As we were walking forward, the teacher told us to imagine walking backward until we were walking forward and backward at the same speed. In other words, standing. What an incredible effort it can be to even stand without support. There's a vernacular phrase like the farmer said to the tater, I'll plant you now and dig you later. Later, delayed, late, belated. Sometimes I use this word belated to describe the sense I have of my already delayed arrival. And I mean belated both in the sense of coming too late and also staying too late, and also detained beyond the usual time, as well as the original meaning overtaken by the lateness of the night, or out of date, or simply overtaken by darkness. The artist and philosopher Hito Steyerl has a very particular definition for identity: exhaustion in common. She says, for many people and for many reasons and on so many levels, identity is just that, shared exhaustion. I was thinking about that, and I read that the word rest was originally a measure of distance, like a mile or a league or an ocean. A rest was the distance from one sleep to another. And the dictionary says the origin, like where it came from, is unknown. Perhaps it's speculated that it might date to the nomadic period. And I honor the call to rest, and yet sometimes I wonder whether restlessness might not be the right political condition. And then I think about recklessness as maybe an inevitable methodological extension. We can't be wrecked any more than we already are, I think. So perhaps recklessness or foolishness is, as Newton demanded, our mandate. Holy fools, blessed fools, the way Newton said Paul was a fool for Christ. And yet I fret about this call to be a fool. I know that I am not foolish enough, and this is the last set of questions. If foolishness is a signal of hope, why does it so often look and feel, I don't know, maybe like failure, or maybe like waste? Another way to put this question is, am I doing enough to weaponize my desire? I'll plant you now, I'll dig you later. But what about when the space between planting and digging feels interminable, and it's hard to know if you planted at all? When every time you dig, all you see is the seed? Still. And maybe just for a transition, I'll turn the audio on and we can listen to just a little bit of this work, which has a pretty involved soundtrack. Start here. Oops. Thanks, guys. I'm happy to answer any questions. Byron? Oh my gosh, I'm sorry.
I don't know if this is a question, but I just found it so fascinating, the turn from restlessness, or the turning from the direction of restlessness to recklessness towards the end, and thinking about whether you had, did you say you had, whether you had weaponized your desire enough, and I just quickly looked up the etymology of reckless, because I could figure out the other ones a little bit. And it has to do, it sort of has to do with a disregard for the well-being of others. So like, it's so interesting politically what all that whole universe of turning at the end there.
Yeah, thank you for that observation. No, it's true. I mean, I'll say, I can't believe I'm going to say this, but as a Capricorn,
We've been doing that a lot here.
I am governed by a sense of incredible responsibility that can often be like really powerfully limiting. And one of the things that for me, my sort of internal compass always tells me that the right way to think of others and also to think of myself is I'll just say is like to follow the rules and do the thing that I'm supposed to do. And yet there is also a part of me that knows that there is nothing that we have done this far that so far that has gotten us anywhere that we need to replicate. So why? What is it? And I've turned, and it's interesting, this kind of relationship between restlessness and recklessness, I started to think about it in relation to this one. There's this like Nina Simone quotation in which she talks about restlessness and recklessness and wanting to turn people. She says, I want to make people just go to pieces. I want to make people just go to pieces, she says. And she describes this sense of wanting to almost wreck the kind of peace of the experience of the kind of community of listeners. And I was reflecting on that, meditating on that, and also thinking about the. So I've done a lot of research relating to circus because of this work that I've been doing, both around human pyramids and in relation to pantomime. And so I've thought a lot about the role of someone like a jester or a fool, and the kind of peculiar way in which the fool or the jester actually has the most intimate relation to power, like the most intimate relation to the king, and from that place is able to produce imagine powerful change. Of course, there's also maybe a complicity in the case of that particular relationship of the jester or the fool and like a court jester in the court. Nonetheless, I began to think about whether there might not be something, some seed of something interesting in thinking about recklessness as a different kind of orientation. I'll say also that I started to meditate on this and write about this and think about this also in connection with what I think of as a kind of classic description of recklessness or evocation of recklessness in contemporary American culture, which for me is really the description of kind of violence in the wake of, or rioting in the wake of violence. And the idea of recklessness and recklessness, the kind of political riot and political noise is something that, as these kind of activities of social disarray, that sort of activity of disarray, and the potential or the possibilities there. So I don't know, that wasn't so super clear, but those are some of the things that I've thought about in relation to this, to that question and that problem. The kind of problem of responsibility, or the problem of regard for others, and its relation to how I think about what it is that I'm supposed to do. I think Newton's notion of what's helpful for me about the notion of revolutionary suicide and the concept of longing for another shore is that it imagines, first of all, it enlists everyone in the same kind of political struggle. Everyone is sort of together because we are all linked both in our lives and in our deaths. And it also enables us to imagine a future that's so far beyond the horizon of what I would ordinarily think about right now, that I can imagine a greater good that I may not even be able to see. And that maybe the only thing I can do is this is maybe something I'm offering also, that one of the only things that we can do is take steps away from what we have, even if it's not toward anything specific yet, even if it seems disorganized, or I don't know. This is much longer than you probably wanted, but those are some responses to. Yes.
My question, I think, is who or what are you trying to mimic or replicate in your own life? If it's a person or a thing or a place or a feeling, and what might that be?
That's interesting. I think I'm gonna offer an unfair response to that question and say that I'm more interested in thinking about that other genealogy, that other etymology of pantomime, imitator of the real. So what I really think about is how can I turn my body or my practice into a space that can accommodate, or can serve as a lens, or can serve as a can offer an opening toward the real in a way that maybe it doesn't doesn't have to do with copying something that already exists, but rather creating a space for something deeper to surface. Does that make sense? But of course, I always think about, I mentioned, I'm haunted by this sensation that I myself am belated, and I do think a lot about my relationship to my predecessors and my community. I was listening to this interview, this conversation. It was actually also with Fred Moten, in which and Hanif Abdurraqib, in which Hanif was saying that he sort of exists to be his father's listener, like a kind of audience for and mediator for a generation before him. I think about that a lot. I don't know, maybe it's like an elder millennial thing, but I often feel like very, very much as though I'm in a kind of mediating position. Mm-hmm.
Why do you choose to use black and white instead of color in certain video and color in certain video?
That's interesting. That's kind of a that is a really interesting question.
Would you to repeat the question?
Sure. He asked, why do I choose to use black and white sometimes and color sometimes? I don't know that I have a single response. I don't know that I have like a single overriding perspective. I'll say that often I'm thinking about color, making decisions about color in relation to a few different factors. I'm certainly thinking about the vernacular media context within which the work circulates, and like, do I want it to look like TV? Do I want it to look like something else? Do I want it to look special, or do I want it to look ordinary? Those kinds of questions I think about a lot, and so sometimes I consider it also in relation maybe to the format, like the presentation format. If the work is going to be shown on a monitor, is it going to be shown via projection? Is it projected onto the wall? Is it projected onto like a screen or in a sculptural way? Of course, all of those distinctions are totally flattened in this context where everything is just like an image. But I really think about the images and the works, the whole thing, and particularly about the encounter that the viewer will ultimately have with the work, and that is what influences my decision. And sometimes it changes from one work to the next, or even within a work like this, similitude begins in black and white and then moves into color, and that's very deliberate. There's like a huge shift in the work that happens when it shifts to color. Thank you for that question. Mm-hmm.
First I want to say that I really appreciated that in the beginning you said that that we were sort of allowed for like our minds to wander. So I think sometimes my mind will wander and makes me feel like I'm being a bad listener, but sort of that like confirmation that I'm being a very good listener actually.
Yes.
You know, whenever
Yes.
I go on tangents with the stuff that you're saying. And I was curious about, so you asked, I'm pretty sure this is correct, am I doing enough to weaponize my desire?
Yeah.
What does weaponizing your desire mean? And I'm curious about if there's a link between that and what you say about like opening towards the real and like what like desires relationality to that.
Yeah, so when I was talking about weaponizing my desire, I was really thinking about this notion of an arrow of longing for another shore. I'm really interested in the idea of an arrow both as like a direction, like a cardinal direction or a compass kind of direction, but then also it is a weapon. There is another way to think of it as a weapon. Rammellzee also used weapon to describe individual letters, glyphs. He described individual letters or words as weapons, and developed a really interesting framework for thinking about the ways. His argument was sort of that writing as a technology has been used to enforce violence. Essentially, it's like a tool of colonization, and he suggests that it's possible to turn that, to like reclaim it or to reframe it in a different way. So those are some of the ways that I think about weapons. And when I talk about weaponizing my desire, partly I'm really thinking about, well, how am I taking all of these sort of interests and inclinations and wanderings that I just described? How am I turning those into tools for the political and imaginative goals that are so important to me, that I reference, that are so compelling and necessary? Like, what am I doing in order to make my desires into the thing that they need to be? And so I'm referencing it in part in relation to failure, like that paragraph. I don't know why that was where I was when I finished writing. It's I'm kind of describing this feeling of disappointment in maybe my own self, this sense of this kind of question about whether I'm fully able to do even what I'm calling for. My failure to be a fool, for example. I feel like there's another part to your question.
Well, I was sort of just wondering, maybe rhetorically, but I was just really drawn to you talking about how your work and yourself, you're trying to like open towards the real or what have you, and I wonder like how those two thoughts connect maybe. But
Yeah. I don't know if there's a direct connection, but I mean, I think this question of the real and what it means to open yourself towards the real, it's not like it's, I mean, I talked about it a lot in relation to performance, and I used pantomime and the history of pantomime as one way to think about how we approach this classic problem that all artists think about, which is like the distance between a representation and its subject, or and the violence or loving embrace that the activity of representation itself offers, like the way in which to represent is can be an act of care, or it can sometimes be an act of great distortion, and that produces actually a great distance between the representation and the real. I think about that. I mentioned that my background is in language and literature, so of course for me, and also I grew up like in the 90s, so I during a moment in which maybe it was like a preoccupation of many thinkers, philosophers, and scholars, especially in Black studies, to think about this kind of question of the distance between language and its referent, like language and its object, and so, but you can equally, it's a problem that equally applies to pictures. Yeah. And I'm also interested in thinking about it in relation to the body. That was like, something that was sort of a way into using pantomime to address that. Does that make sense? Sort of, yeah. Thank you for those. Hi.
You mentioned, and I kind of just hung on these 3 words that I wanted to know. You had mentioned stroke with art. And I wondered if you wanted to know if you could like elaborate on those, just those 3 words, just so they can sticking with change that interpretation proceedings.
Sure. I wrote an essay for Art Forum a few years ago that I'm sure Lisa and Byron can pass along, that that shares some of the same excerpts that I shared today, and that discusses in much more detail the ways that I've been thinking through this question of the relationship between writing and drawing, and how a mark can be like it can be a component of a drawing, or it can be a part of a letter. And so when you have like a succession of marks or an accumulation of marks, and those two are different, like are we thinking about them temporally? Are we thinking about them pictorially? Those are 2 different things. That opens up the possibility of these 2 almost competing ways of looking at the same material, like as a piece of writing or as a drawing. And then I'm thinking, and then what I think offers a really interesting way into that is looking at ways in which people learn to write, and particularly stories in which, for a variety of really, complex and important political reasons, someone didn't want to inherit a relationship to writing from a master, but rather develop a relationship to writing for themselves. And that opens up a totally new set of possibilities for where a mark can come from and what it can mean. Yeah, if that is a helpful sort of way in. And then, yes, this text I think is a really good, I didn't go into it too much because I knew you would have another opportunity to read that. I didn't want to be redundant with my own self, but yeah.
I just wanted to be mindful of Steffani's energy and maybe just take one more question if that's okay, Steffani?
Yeah.
Or does somebody have? I'll ask another question. You seem to have looked into the history
Something
of
else to look at.
human pyramids. Do you know when that, in the media or otherwise, when that stopped being a common practice for people to get out of fixes? Or maybe is there a contemporary, did it evolve into some other way of getting out of such situations, or resolving those kind of problems? Because I found it really fascinating, that because I never really heard of that before, but it seems to have been a thing.
Yeah, that is such a good and interesting way of posing that question. I guess maybe like I should talk to like a material historian who could tell me that like maybe, you know, I don't know, ladders are more prevalent or something. I have no idea. I think for me, what's really interesting is that it's like a definitely a particular way of thinking about risk and like sort of taking something upon yourself it's kind of taking like the most difficult, but also the solution that involves only your own body and nothing else, which is so fascinating. And so it opens up all of these ways for me. It's relating to some of the other, it's connected to some of the other problems that I described, but really this thing of like, how do you know what you can do? Like, how do you know what you know? Is a problem that I'm really like obsessed with, and to me feels like it's also really at the heart of so many other political challenges that we face, and sort of I guess I'll say interpersonal, or like ways of thinking about our relation to the other. Like how do you know what you know? How do you know what your limits are? And also what does it mean to allow yourself to be used by someone else, or to be, and I said to be of service or to be a means, but I was, it actually goes back to this thing before about the fool. Like, what does it mean to allow yourself, what does it mean to sometimes to allow yourself to be a means actually means to not be meaning making on your own, right? It's like in the service of something that may be resolved only later. So that doesn't get at your historical question, which I don't know the answer to, but those are some of the things that it makes me think about.
Thank you so much.